And I'm sure there's at least one person in this room that can predate me even before that. But basically, the web's been around for quite a while now. And I ended my presentation. And we'll just keep going. I run the Omaha jQuery meetup, and that is in Omaha, Nebraska. That's where I reside and have been for the past 4 years. I've lived in other portions of the country, but one of the things I like to point out about Omaha, wherever I go, is that you'll notice that the member count for the Omaha meetup is 90. So we actually do have technology there. We do have a lot of corn. But it really is a thriving community and one that's been a lot of fun to be a part of. So if you're ever flying over Omaha, feel free to stop sometime and hang around. Additionally, I co-founded Append2, which is a company dedicated to jQuery, about a year ago in October. Right now we have 8 employees. We're in 7 states. We're a fully distributed company that has a lot of fun aspects to it and then a lot of challenges, as you can imagine. So that's my day job. After 5 p.m., Monday through Friday and weekends, I'm a cowboy. And I have to ask, are there any cowboys in the room or cowgirls? Oh, hey. Oh, my goodness. OK. I was in Austin, Texas. You would think that there'd be a cowboy in Austin, Texas, and there wasn't. So this is awesome. This is the first time that I've had a positive yes. OK. Ready for jQuery. So being from the Midwest, here we go. This is mutton busting. And so I try and bring some culture wherever I go. This guy has a little bit more enthusiasm, and that is not mutton busting. OK. So really, there are 4 questions that we're going to answer, and then we'll get into some code. Basically, where did this jQuery come from? What was the environment that produced it? Why is it so popular? How has it really changed our development? And I think we've started to get a taste of that tonight. And then additionally, how is it driving innovation forward? And where are we looking at going over the next couple years? So first, the web as we know it, this is one of the things. It's highly complex. It's highly technical. There's a lot of dynamic aspects to it in terms of how a solution is brought forth. And then additionally, the exponential growth. If you look at the way that the web has been adopted just over the past 10 years. So we think back to 2000, and at the time I was working for a startup, and we were doing a web-based application. And this was exciting, but no one really thought anything about it. It was like, oh, well, that's great. You're putting an application on the web. And we didn't even really call it a web application. It was our website. And now there's this distinction that's taken place. So oftentimes you'll hear it's just HTML, it's just CSS, it's just JavaScript. So we've kind of come through this progression where you'd go to introduce yourself and you say, oh, I'm a software developer. Yeah. Oh, what do you do? I'm a web developer. Oh, you do JavaScript. And so no one really took it seriously until a couple things started happening, which is in 2006, jQuery came along. And jQuery kind of made it really easy for people to stop thinking about the technicalities of coding and really more experimenting, innovating. And that forth has really started to go and change the whole industry and how we perceive JavaScript and where we're at today. So this is just kind of a sampling of the technologies that you work with. So one of the things that's really exciting being in the web-based field is that there is an extreme diversity in technologies that we work with. So you go from one large organization to a small startup, and you're working with a totally different stack. You're working with the same browsers, for example, but one's on Java, another one's on PHP. You have some ASP.NET in there. There's really a highly dynamic nature in terms of how you can implement a solution. So this gets us into the web is really rich with innovation. So it really drives innovation because there's all this complexity, and there's new ways that we can plug things together. So basically, there's a huge number of problems that need to be solved. And this takes us back to 2006. Client side wasn't terribly exciting. You use some JavaScript, but usually it's for a menu component, for example. You may have the FAQ page that you were expanding the answers with. That was really amazing. But really, it was tedious DOM programming. And at the same time, you were having to look, okay, is this Netscape that I'm programming for? Is it IE? You had to think about a lot of these things, and that in turn was a barrier to entry. Because most of the developers were still on the back end, and when they would go to the front end, they didn't want to think about, oh my goodness, it's not rendering in this browser. It really didn't matter. And a lot of the time, we were still targeting a single browser. Okay, so this was around the time when jQuery was born. John Reseg had this brilliant idea. And this kind of brings us to the next point of what is a web developer really? Really a craftsman. If you look at all of the different projects and jobs that you've worked across, most likely they're not all the same. You go from one job to another, and again, highly dynamic technology stack, and you're skilled at integrating, because that's really what a web developer has become these days. It's an integration-driven developer. You solve problems by taking discrete components and mixing them together. Okay, and the point being, too, that good tools generally win unless a company buys them and then sticks it on the shelf, which is always sad. So that's where, again, open source is one of the joys of working in the web development field. Okay, so this brings us to, we now have jQuery. I'll get into a little bit more about the details of that. But we have jQuery. Fast forward 4 years to now. And why did jQuery win? What was it that changed this industry? And that is, it integrates well. It plays well with all of these other components that you're using to build your applications. And so this is like hands down. There's a whole bunch of other reasons why it did succeed. But hands down, it's an integration-centric tool that plays well with others. So jQuery additionally grew because it did something in its approach to integrating, and that was it leveraged existing skill sets of developers. So you know how much of a hurdle it is when you go and you pick up a new language or a new tool, and sometimes it's really easy to just say, oh, I read a book over the weekend, I know the syntax, I can jump into it. But oftentimes, you look for those familiar concepts that you can bring forward. jQuery leveraged this. So we saw CSS selectors. Well, as front-end web developers back in 2006, we weren't thinking about the DOM in the terms of a programmatic sense, but we were thinking about it from a style and design sense. So we were very comfortable and very familiar writing CSS selectors and expressions and that type of thing. And jQuery said, oh, you know, that's a really great pattern. Maybe I'm going to use that for then programmatically accessing the DOM, which, like I said before, was this big, tedious beast, and no one even dove into it because it was such a barrier to entry. So this improved then developer efficiency, and it lowered the barrier to entry. So people and developers that typically before would never look at JavaScript with any type of seriousness, because I had to go learn this whole DOM thing and like how to access elements and all this, jQuery said, hey, you know CSS selectors. Go ahead and make use of that. And now let's just add a little bit of syntactic sugar, a really nice API that's flexible, and I can be a backend developer that starts dabbling with this front end a little bit, and it's kind of exciting. And it's not quite as hard as I thought. And all of these cross-browser issues that I was having to deal with in terms of event binding and DOM manipulation, all that, jQuery kind of smoothed that all over. And so what happened then was people started getting very creative. They started to stop having to think about the DOM itself, and in turn started really thinking about ways that I can express new and creative solutions to those problems that I'm typically doing with server-side static HTML. Additionally, we had Ajax really kind of come in as a pattern that we could use, and it started opening up a lot more of the web as a development platform, and one where we could do a lot tighter integration closer to the client. Okay. That's all to say, additionally, jQuery being an open source product really fostered a community. So the way that I got involved with jQuery, it was 2006. I was working for Union Pacific Railroad and working on a particular project for tracking vehicle logistics. And I was tasked with redoing the front end in the UI. So at the time, we were looking for tools and libraries to kind of help us. And I came across jQuery by the recommendation of a colleague. And this was March. And so jQuery had been out for 3 months. And there was maybe 100 developers on the mailing list, if that. But one of the things is that there's a community that you could get involved with, and one that was really beneficial and helped you to learn. So jQuery really excelled. If jQuery didn't have a strong community, it would not be where it is today. And it would not continue to go on to where it's going in terms of innovation if that community isn't served. So again, the joys of open source. Finally, John Resick, who created jQuery, really has done a phenomenal job at protecting the core of jQuery. So and there's a couple ways that he did this. So back in the early days of jQuery, started gaining popularity, and with that becomes feature requests. So everyone has their particular situation and their itch that they need scratched, and this new cool feature is just like 3 lines of code, but it will solve my problem. Well, John protected the core of jQuery, and he was like, no, 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 no. And Yehuda can back me up on this. No, no, no. And then John said, you know what? You can write a plugin. A plugin's a very low-cost way to extend jQuery, and go ahead and add your feature and your functionality there. And if it gains enough traction, then I'll pull it into core, but only after it gains extensive traction. So the prime example of that happening is the Dimensions plugin, which started off as a way to correctly calculate the dimensions of an element cross-browser. And it used to be this plugin that you had to pull in all the time. And the fact that everyone was pulling it in, like literally everyone's pulling, you download jQuery, you download the Dimensions plugin. Then it came to the point where it's like, okay, for the benefit of the community, let's pull dimensions in. But beyond that, John has really protected the core vision of jQuery. And that's not to say that there hasn't been new innovation, but you'll see how that kind of has come out in sub-aspects of the larger jQuery project. Okay, so what is jQuery itself? It's really a DOM-centric library, and it has an API. And we've kind of started to see this already tonight in some of the code demos. But really, the key points to pull out here is the plugin architecture. And again, one of the key successes. Because when someone would come with a feature request, John didn't have to say no. He would say, no, it's not going into core, but write a plugin. And so, again, fostering the community, there's the ability for you to write code specific to your situation, to share it with others. And again, the success of jQuery. So then the primary focus, jQuery makes working with the DOM really easy. The DOM in itself is a totally different programming paradigm when you come from, say, maybe a traditional Java backend for websites. Now, if you come from a desktop environment where you're developing desktop apps, you may have some experience with kind of an evented model, an evented pattern. But typically, from a web developer, especially if you come from like a designing background, not from a programmatic one, you're going to get into this front-end stuff and you're like, whoa, events. And it's just, it's a different way to wrap your head around things. So jQuery made working with this DOM, this living document, really easy, and that pushed forward to what we typically think of as a web application today. Something that's highly dynamic. There's usually not a page refresh, and it's one where information is very much on demand. So the response time, the tolerance for users is much lower. If I click a search, I don't want the whole search results. I want to autocomplete. Where 4 years ago, that was a full page refresh. And again, the key component, again, is the AJAX. jQuery took that particular aspect of it and wrapped a really nice API around it and made it really easy to do. Okay, are you with me? Okay. You got to back me up here. Are you with me? Yes. Much better. Okay. So what is jQuery not? And this dovetails excellently on the previous presentation. It's not a shortcut to learning JavaScript. You definitely can get in and start doing things with jQuery in a very low-cost way, but you don't want to say, well, I don't need to learn JavaScript then. Because it goes to my second point, and a bulletproof vest will not keep you from shooting yourself in the foot. Okay? So think about that. I know it's late. jQuery will not prevent you from shooting yourself in the foot. And that's kind of one of the things that it becomes really easy, but you've seen some of the syntactic sugar that goes along with JavaScript, and it's very possible with closures and whatnot to kind of get out there and stuff appears to be working and it's not. So in your quest to start getting into jQuery, make sure that you're also getting into JavaScript itself. Okay. And additionally, it's not an excuse to avoid learning web development best practices. You still have to say, I'm going to look at the craft and the skills required and make sure that I'm learning as much as possible. Now, one of the first things is that can be a hindrance in itself because of the huge technology stack. Well, you need to think of it in 2 years from now and saying, where do I want to be with my skill set, with my career, And if you're not already a front-end developer and that's something you want to get into, start learning now, and jQuery is a great way to get into that. Okay. We'll skip that. Here are some plugins. These were talked about previously. I'll skip over this so we can get to the code. Okay, so I talked about this innovation. There's jQuery core itself, which you can go to jQuery.com, pull that down. There's jQuery UI. So there's this core aspect of jQuery. Then they said, hey, we need some UI components. This originally started as a suite of plugins called Interface, which then was officially taken over by the jQuery project and turned into jQuery UI. So jQuery UI has a totally separate sub-team on the jQuery project from the jQuery core team, and they deliver a completely different set of release. They have a completely different release cycle. They generally release at the same time that jQuery core does, but they have a more active release cycle and a totally different core mission. And that's to provide UI components that are fully supported, fully themable. It's really awesome. Check it out, jQueryui.com. So that wasn't exciting enough. So then this whole mobile thing is getting, really kind of exciting. It's heating up. I guess we should get into the game. So John Resig did this extensive amount of research. Yehuda called that out in his presentation of the browsers that are out there. And so then the jQuery project got behind jQuery Mobile, which is in alpha release right now. Will probably land in January. And that is another really innovative solution to getting into the mobile space with a very low cost to entry. So literally, jQuery Mobile, one of the strengths of it is it really follows a nice syntactic convention pattern. So you technically don't have to write any JavaScript to do a jQuery Mobile app, which is really cool. We'll get into that hopefully if we get enough time at the end, so I'll keep going through these slides. Additionally, QUnit. So how many of you are unit testers? Okay, it's not too bad. Sometimes I get like one person, and they're usually really excited about it. Woohoo! Okay, so QUnit is really awesome. It's something that we at Append2 are using for our clients a lot of the times. And it's this unit testing framework that, again, John came up with and some other people in the jQuery project. And it's another really nice little nugget of innovation in terms of being able to write tests surrounding your code. So jQuery itself is fully covered with test coverages. Yehuda, how many tests are there for jQuery core? 1,000, something like that. So that's really exciting. I know you all love writing tests. So QUnit, short, sweet, makes it really easy. I'll get into a quick demo of that. Okay, so you write your unit test. You need a way to push it out to the browser then. So John, who's employed by Mozilla, was working on this project called TestSwarm. So TestSwarm is really cool because you write your QUnit tests. You then, on a post-commit hook, for example, push them over to TestSwarm, which schedules them to browsers that are out in the wild waiting to poll. They're polling, waiting for tests to come into the queue, and then it will push it out, execute the test, push the results back to TestSwarm, which then aggregates them in real time. Okay. So, again, a nice little nugget of functionality that came out of the jQuery project, something that you can really work and integrate into a continuous integration type environment. jQuery itself uses this. It's fully covered with tests, and that's why it's one of the most stable pieces of software out there. Okay. Finally, Sizzle, which is the selector engine. So jQuery initially started with a selector engine baked into core itself, but that was a piece of functionality that really made a lot of sense to abstract out and provide for use for other libraries. So you'll see this floating around Sizzle.js. What is it? It's the selector engine that is pulled into jQuery core itself. And again, if you're writing your own totally separate library, you can pull Sizzle in itself and benefit from that. Okay. So here's jQuery Mobile. Here's kind of a breakdown of the UI. I'll pull up some code in a minute. But if you have a mobile device, feel free to go to jQueryMobile.com. And if you click on the demos link at the top, it'll pull you into this. The documentation for how to write a jQuery mobile app is right here. It's in jQuery Mobile itself. And feel free to go through and start pulling that. The source for this is out on GitHub, so you can clone it and pull the latest, but it's in hot development right now. jQueryui.com. The thing that's to point out that's really slick is the theme roller aspect of it. So it's a full UI that you can go in and tweak all of the aspects of the theme itself, from colors to rounded corners to not rounded corners, etc., and download a custom zip for that, which you can then pull in. And QUnit, here's a sample output of QUnit. Unit testing is always very exciting, so I had a screenshot of it. But you'll notice that we have one failed test down at the bottom, and it's something that's really great to get into a practice of as you write your code itself. So getting into the jQuery community itself, there's a couple exciting things in the work. One is that there's a initiative going on right today and yesterday for beefing up the community tutorial. So there's something coming down the pipeline there, definitely something to watch out for. You can follow jQuery on Twitter or jQuery.com, as it will be widely publicized. That should be out shortly. The plugins are a great way to get involved. GitHub is a great source of plugins and one of the most active places to find them. There's api.jQuery.com. You get your full overload of the jQuery API and all of its goodness. And then finally, the community forums. This is really, just because of the scale and scope that the community has grown to, we really had to push back to going to a forum type solution. We were on a Google Groups mailing list, and once you get like 20,000 people, it doesn't scale. And so this is a great way to get involved. Very low cost to entry. You just create an account, hop on there, and there's a ton of people that were able to help you get into jQuery, as well as a huge wealth of information for problems previously solved. Meetups. Omaha Meetup is a great one. You're more than welcome to move to Omaha and join the meetup. Or if you're just coming through, you can also join it that way. But we meet first Wednesday of the month. Conferences. So jQuery Boston is kind of the big conference of the year. That was this past October, 4 weeks ago. In Boston, there will be one in the spring, usually in the West Coast somewhere. Last year we had it at Microsoft down south a little bit. So be sure to watch for that coming down the pipeline. A great way to come and meet the jQuery team and get a couple days of more jQuery than you ever wanted. Okay. So I am going to call out a couple things. This again dovetails the previous presentation. So if you're looking to get into development, here are some core concepts that you really want to get under your belt. So some topics to start looking into. First is the DOM and like what that is. So the DOM is the programmatic representation of the HTML that you delivered to the browser or modified with jQuery. And so it's really what you're going to be working with. You're going to be working with this document in the browser with jQuery to modify it. So there's a couple other things that come into play when you're dealing with this DOM, such as events and event propagation. So this is probably the first stumbling block, or one of the early ones that you get into when you start dealing with jQuery, is this whole events and how they work in the browser. So we'll talk about this when we get into the code a little bit. CSS and selectors, a great way. Dive into that. You benefit twofold. One is in the design aspect of your page itself, as well as writing jQuery selectors. HTML5 is hot. HTML5rocks.com. HTTP, this is one of the things where this distinguishes a beginner to intermediate developer, is understanding HTTP and what a get and a post is. So I won't cover it in this presentation, but look it up. Also, cross-domain and security. So what situations can you make an AJAX request to another domain, and how that works and plays out in the browser. It's mentioned. JSON. We saw some JSON goodness earlier, as well as scope and closure, which you're all now experts at. Okay. Going forward, what's on the roadmap? One of the questions that's really hot right now is, does jQuery support HTML5? Yes, it does. It has for a while, and it will continue to support it. There's not a whole lot of anything that's big and scary with HTML5. So really get into it. Don't be afraid of like, well, that's something else I have to learn. If you know HTML, moving to HTML5 is very painless, and it's something that you can actually use today. I know the spec won't be done until like 2022 or whenever, but you can use it today. Like, it works in the browsers. So get on board. Okay. Support for new browsers like IE9 with coming out. Again, I talked about the test coverage that jQuery has with 1,000-some tests. That makes it really easy to then run jQuery through IE9 and start addressing issues there. And so that's something that's there's a high level of response from the jQuery team in addressing those. Mobile browser, jQuery Mobile is something that, again, is in alpha right now, will be out in January, and is something that you can look forward to in the months and the weeks and the years to come. And additionally, growth of really corporate support services. So this is one of the things that's exciting, especially since I work for Append2 and we offer corporate support services, is that there is an ecosystem now where the jQuery community itself is so large that there's really a need for this in the traditional sense of business. So I work for a large enterprise, and yes, we didn't pay anything for jQuery, but we still need a support contract to be able to pull it into the enterprise. So now there's those resources that are available, which makes it even greater adoption within the corporate enterprise. So enough said with that. Okay, so now we get into some code. So, yes?
Can you explain animation in jQuery?
Oh, I'm sorry, say it again?
jQuery animation.
jQuery animation, yes. Okay, jQuery animation, we'll get into that. I've got some of the demo code that we're going through. I'm going to go ahead and hit record on my screen. Yes, start recording. This is the exciting part anyway. Okay. So, this is really kind of a fun demo because we start to dig into some of the concepts of jQuery itself. We start using some of the events, some of the patterns, and we can really, this is a great point to start raising your hand and asking questions. Shout them out a little bit because I can't hear the best sometimes if they're in the back. But we'll go through and really start digging in here. So this is an example of how you can do an edit in place type behavior. So this is something that traditionally you would have to do a lot of DOM scripting to get this to work in a browser, yet alone multiple browsers. And jQuery makes this really easy. And so we'll dig in here. Get the right code up in place. Okay, so shame on me. I'm not using HTML5. So yeah, forgive me. But here's your traditional HTML document. And we have an unordered list with a series of list items in it. So first thing you got to do, jQuery 101, hello world, include jQuery. So here's my jQuery.js. And then I have an additional script block here. And this is where we're going to get into the edit in place. So can you all see in the back, is the font size okay? Yep, okay. Now you're going to notice that I'm going to do some interesting things with indentation in the way that I format my code that at first may be a little bit difficult and unfamiliar if you start getting into this. But when you start writing more and more code, it makes it really easy to identify patterns quickly and discover what's going on. So first thing, I'm going to kick off my jQuery selector here, $unordered list item. So this is going to select all of the unordered list, all of the list items that are descendants of the unordered list on the page, and I'm going to bind a double-click event to that. So I personally tend to use bind instead of the shorthand methods. You could additionally rewrite this right here as the double-click. I just like the explicit nature of bind syntax. And once we have that double click, now what we're going to do is we're going to jump in. There's a couple things we got to do to get this edit in place to work. First is we got to grab the text value of that HTML node itself. And we talked about context a little bit in this. So in my callback for my bound event here to the double click, this is going to reference the list item that was double clicked. So I can then take this, and you can see on this line here, I'm wrapping this in a jQuery object itself. So we talked about the way that you can pass in different selectors and such, in the way that the jQuery object itself is very flexible. So you can pass in a function to it, which executes on document.ready. You can pass in a string selector to it. You can pass in a DOM node itself and initialize jQuery with that. So this is the native browser's DOM element. It's not a jQuery wrapped object. It's just that native DOM element. I'm going to take that, wrap it in jQuery so I get all the jQuery methods in, that I can use to operate on it. And I'm going to call .text. So that will grab out and give me the text value of that node without any of the HTML tags, yada, yada, yada. Now that I have that, I'm going to do this .empty. And that will go ahead and wipe out the inner HTML of that text node. Okay, are you following the progression here? So we've grabbed the text value, we've emptied the field. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use a nice little trick that jQuery provides. And I'm going to pass in an HTML fragment to jQuery itself. And it's going to magically instantiate it for me and then allow me to go and set some properties on it and then stick it back into the DOM. So I'm going to create a new input field. I'm going to do .val, which is going to set the text value that I just extracted as the value of that input field. Then I'm going to bind a key down event, and that's going to be associated with that input field, which then I'm going to listen for key code 13, which is the return character. Very good. And when that happens, I'm going to tell it to exit the field, and on we go. So, and then I'm binding a blur event, which then takes the value upon exiting the field and sticks it back into the DOM, removing the input. Okay. That's all to say the final line here, which is where append2 got its inspiration for a company name. And I must say it's a great name, especially when you try and explain it to your parents who are not programmers. Append2, or you're on the phone and you try and say, yeah, I work for append2. Can you spell that? Yep. Okay. Just a little bit of wisdom there. Okay. So then we take that input field and we stick it back into the DOM. So this, again, is a very, very relatively short amount of code, and I've got a lot of really highly dynamic things going on here. So then if we see this in practice, once again, okay, here we go. Here's my input field. And you'll notice that it's now updated in the DOM itself. If I go in and inspect this in Firebug, oh, phooey. I forget how to, here we go. Okay, and you can see I've actually modified the DOM itself. So this is, if you don't know what the DOM is, you can see this is where we're starting to work with it. It's a programmatic representation of the HTML, and I'm manipulating it with JavaScript. jQuery is really good at that. Okay. So now we have the same pattern as we did before. So I can do hello world. I can spell. And I'm going to go and add a new feature that when I click add new list item, I'm going to go and create that element and make it editable. So let's take a look at that. And I'm going to introduce a different concept here. Okay, so we talked about events, executing selectors. One of the things that you will notice is in the previous example, I am going to execute this selector ul.li at the top. That is going to select all the elements that exist in the DOM at that point in time when that selector was executed. That works great until you start dynamically inserting elements. So there's a couple ways that you could do that. When you insert a new element, you could then go through and bind all those same events and that type of thing. That's not very exciting. A better way to do it is what, again, we saw in our previous, the use of .live, or another method called .delegate, which does a similar thing, but we're going to make use of a pattern in the DOM, which is event propagation, and we're going to leverage that. So what I'm going to do here is, here's my unordered list, and I'm going to call .delegate li double click. So what this is going to do, this is going to attach an event handler to my unordered list. It's going to then, in attaching the event handler, it's going to attach the double click event. That event handler then is going to listen specifically for double click events that originated on a list item here. Okay? This is where the benefit is huge, because I'm going to attach one click handler to the unordered list. However many list items I insert, add, remove, whatever, when a user double clicks on that, the event's going to first trigger any double click handlers on that list item itself. Then that event gets handed up to its parent, which in this case would be an unordered list, which has the event handler and it's going to trigger it. So there's a question. Yes?
And that's just regular DOM event dispatch.
That's just the regular DOM event dispatch, and that's how it works. And when the unordered list is done with that event, it will continue handing it up all the way until it hits the document object itself. This is excellent and very exciting. I will tell you, before event delegation, events were a little more hairy. So, okay. Any other questions at this point? You all are in just awe of the awesomeness of jQuery.
Why is that different from a live with a UL space LI?
Excellent question. Okay, so why does .delegate differ from a .live? So you could implement this and Yehuda, correct me if I'm wrong, with a delegate, it's going to bind it to my unordered list itself in the DOM as opposed to a live where it will bind it higher up in the DOM?
No, the only difference between live and delegate is that live forces you to make a selection of those elements.
Okay. So what he said was the only difference in live is that it forces you to make a selection of those elements at the point when you execute. So this is going to go out and look for all list items within an unordered list right then versus with .delegate where it is going to defer looking for any LI elements until an event originates on them and that event bubbles up.
Right, we'll never, like, imagine you have a case with like a table with 1 million cells in it. If you did $td.live, you still have to select all those cells, where if you do $document.delegate td, then you never made that selection.
Yep. So it's a huge performance benefit at the time of binding and setting up events. Okay. We have the same style of code in the body of this, such as var text. To pull out the text, we're going to empty it, and we're going to append it. One of the things that you'll notice here is that we're going to start using a concept in jQuery called chaining. So write that down. We'll look it up. But basically, you have the ability to select an element and perform a series of operations on it by doing .next method. So I have $this, .empty, .append. So it's going to take my list item, it's going to empty it, and it's going to append a new input, this text. New input is a function that I introduced up here at the top. And it's going to take a target element on which it's going to append the input itself to, as well as the text to stick in the value. So this is just a helper utility method that I made, and it's going to make it really easy then when we do our add new item at the end. Okay. So now, here's our anchor tag with an ID of new item for adding a new list item. So what we're going to do here is we're going to attach a click event, and I'm going to use the shortcut .click. I'm going to create a new list item ad hoc, passing in a HTML element to jQuery. So I now have an instantiated list item object, and I'm going to append to that list item my new input, and I'm going to set up the default value to be your new list item. And that all gets appended to my unordered list with the ID of my list. And you can see that right here. And so now if I do new list item, so one of the things that you'll notice that'd be really cool here is that if I went and actually focused that input field then after it's appended. So what I can do, if I can find my mouse, there, I can do a .find. So I'm going to use chaining, and .find is going to start from the current element, and it's going to look at any siblings. So I'm going to look for an input, and I'm going to call trigger focus, and that is going to actually focus the input of that field. If it works, which it didn't. Pending is find input. Did I? No, that didn't work. Okay, I think it's a timing issue. So what I'm going to do this another way because there are multiple ways to fix things. I can do set timeout. Wait 150 milliseconds for the DOM to stabilize, and then I'm going to do input Okay, there you go. I tell you, thank you, thank you. There's no thrill like writing code in front of 200 people. It's like that extreme programming times 200. Okay, so how much time do I have left here? 10 minutes? 10, okay. I was told midnight, but we'll go with that. Okay, so I had a question about some effects. Here's an example of, there we go, of hiding elements. So jQuery gives you the ability to do animation. Here's an example of where we want this snazzy thing because your boss came and said we have this new requirement and we need animation because we hear it's really cool. And you say, no problem, and you go write the jQuery and it saves your job. Because jobs hinge on animation. So,
And around the corners.
and around the corners. Oh, there's a lot of truth to that. Okay. So here we're going to, in this example here, we have the classic list. We're going to go ahead and use our .delegate method again, which you are all experts on now. And we're going to use this fade out. So if you go to api.jquery.com and you type in fade out, it'll give you all of the syntactic glory of this method. And basically the way it breaks down is you pass in a time. So this is in milliseconds. So 2,000 milliseconds is 2 seconds. And the callback function to execute at the point where the animation is complete. So in this case, I'm going to do something terribly useful, such as alert finished fading. And I'm going to change this to 1,000 just to make it even more exciting. And if I refresh my page, you can see that now it takes a second, and there's my alert at the end. Okay, that's a nice animation example. There's even more exciting ones, such as you can click these buttons, and it does stuff. Like I said, live demos are a thrill. Okay, I'll post the code and you can play around with that. Okay, so here's a more typical use case though. You have a table of data. Well, if that's not clear, I don't know what is. And thus is the slide up effect of jQuery.
It's really powerful.
Okay.
That's a lot of scope.
And this is using the 6,000 millisecond animation time. This has been one of the best presentations so far. Okay, so you, rather than double clicking on the row itself, I'm going to click on the X and you can see that it fades out the row in wonderful glory. You can reset. And what I'm actually doing here, and you can see in the code that I have below it, is I'm going to do a fade out, which is going to just hide that DOM element. I'm not actually removing it from the DOM, which makes it really easy then to reset. I'm going to execute a jQuery selector, tr::hidden. So that's going to go and find all of my table rows that are hidden in the DOM, and I'm going to call .fadeIn normal, and normal is just a string value for a default animation time. Okay, any questions there? Okay, let's keep moving along to the awesome example. Okay, so where this really becomes useful is when we are pulling up my code. Okay. So we're going to do something. We're first going to, when the user chooses to remove a field, we're going to actually animate it being removed, so give some user some feedback. And then we're going to programmatically go back to the server to update state so that that row is then removed when the user continues using that application. So how you could typically do that would be using what we've seen so far, fade out slow. And then down here at the bottom, I have a to-do. Make an AJAX request to a server to remove the row from the database. So you could pull the ID of that row, for example, kick off an AJAX request, basically without a page refresh, and send that back to the server and say, update your state. There's a couple things that you could do then at that point. You could wait for the response to come back from the server, giving you confirmation that that transaction was successful and you don't need to roll back. Or if the transaction failed, you could then fade the row back in and present a pretty message such as, oops, I'm sorry, please try again. Okay. Here is our next example, which we're combining a couple of concepts that we've talked about so far. We have the edit in place as well as the fade out and remove. So I'm using the same behavior, there it goes, to do a couple things. Here's my input, which I'm going to bind it, my double click to the table. This is using, rather than .delegate, this is using .bind and performing a lot of the work behind the scenes to make sure that the element that was clicked is the one. So .delegate is a very nice way to do this without having to do the tedious work of determining what element was particularly clicked. I leave this example in here, though, so that you can see that bind itself is very useful if you really need to get low level to the nuts and bolts of events as they originate and such. Okay. We'll go back to this exciting example. So here I have a list of 50 states, and we're doing a couple things. I'll fire up Firebug here. Now we're getting into, whoa, it's late. Okay, so we're kicking off AJAX requests. So we're going to go, and on page load, we're going to go to the server and request a chunk of data, and then we're going to dynamically render the UI with the data that came back. So if I expand my get here, you can see the response that came back. Here's this wonderful JSON object notation with my list of states that I'm going to iterate over. I have to confess, I'm not using the template plugin, and you could refactor this to use the template plugin, but I didn't for sake of demo. Okay. So let me go find my source here. It's called JSON1. Okay. So what we're going to do, first I declared a function, and you could wrap this entire block into an anonymous self-executing function. I typically don't explain that concept in my presentation, and so I didn't do it here because that would just, that's a rabbit hole. So, but it is a best practice, so do that. But I created a function called load states here. I'm optionally accepting an argument called search that you could then pass in to filter the results. Search just gets passed back to the server itself. So here's what I'm going to do. My PHP script that's serving up the data, I have data.delay, and I can pass in an arbitrary value here, and it will just sleep for that amount, so I can simulate lag of the connection on the server. So I'm going to call .getJSON. This is a nice utility method for the underlying base jQuery function called $.ajax. So $.ajax gives you really the full control over that entire AJAX request. .getJSON gives you the ability to automatically set a number of properties that are typical when requesting JSON, such as the type of data coming back, which is JSON. Okay. So first argument here is the URL. The second argument is data that is passed to the server, so any key value pairs. In this case, data.delay equals 1. And then my callback function to execute at the point when the data is returned from the server. And that callback function is passed the actual data itself. At this point, it's already been evaluated. The data comes from the server as text. It's been evaluated now into an actual JavaScript object literal, which I can start using in programmatically. And the thing to point out here is the way that you deal with JSON data, there's some security concerns around it. Because it used to be when JSON first came out, it was really cheap and easy to get that data back from the server and call eval on it. And a malicious person, not that there are any in this world, but if there was a malicious person, they could pass a function that could potentially arbitrarily get executed. So jQuery in 1.4 upped the ante in terms of it does not eval the code, it does actual parsing of that JSON in a very efficient way, and so there aren't any security concerns with that. So if you have more questions, come talk to me afterwards, and I can talk to you about the joys of security in JavaScript. Okay. So now that I have the data from the server, I select states, which is my table. I select the tbody, child element of that, and I'm going to empty it out. So if I have any existing data in there, I'm going to clear it, and then I'm going to use a utility method, which is $.each. So you can pass an array. This is a very nice way. It's an iterator pattern. So if you come from JavaScript, or excuse me, if you come from JavaScript. If you come from Java or other languages that have iterators, you pass in an array of data, and it executes the callback function, passing the key as the first argument and the value as the second argument. So I'm going to iterate over here and construct a table row and then append to that a series of table data elements, finally appending that to the table. There are ways that you could highly optimize this, but for sake of demonstration, it's a little bit more expanded. Okay, so that gives us, and here is the load states where I execute that on page load. If I go back to my demo, which my scroll is not working. There we go. Okay. So I talked about that search parameter. So now I have the ability to go in as I key in values. So let's go to Nebraska here. You can see that it kicked off an AJAX request down here at the bottom, returned a result set, which was filtered. So the server did all the filtering there. You could do it client side, but I left it to the server. And the response that came back, then I re-rendered the front end. So this is a way that you can start building really dynamic things very quickly with jQuery itself. Okay. In the handful of minutes I have left, I'm going to pull up. So we talked about unit testing. I'm going to talk about mocking just a little bit, because this is not typically something that you think of from the front end. So I wrote a plugin to jQuery, because plugins are really cool in jQuery, called mockjax. What it does is allow you to define a series of parameters that are typical for an AJAX request that would be generated by a developer. And instead of actually letting that AJAX request go off, it will intercept it and allow you to provide mock data back. So where this becomes really beneficial and where this originated from is at Append2, we typically would start a project. Our demarcation point is the front end. We don't do a whole lot of back end. We have experience with it, but we don't typically code it. So we'll start a project and the client will say, hey, I've got this REST-based services. I'm going to give you JSON. And it's going to look like this, but it's going to take us a month to get it done. And we say, no problem. Tell us what it looks like. We'll put the mockjax plugin in there. We're able to mock that entire data using the end live URL that we're going to be calling against. And then when the client says, OK, our web service is ready, we simply remove the mockjax plugin, don't change any of our code, and it goes against production and works beautifully. OK. And there was ooh and ah. OK, so get JSON1 here. Let's see if I have. OK. So first step to using a jQuery plugin is to include it, jQuery.mockjax. What I'm going to do here is go ahead, and this is what I have to do to mock an AJAX request. So you provide a series of parameters that mockjax will use to test as AJAX requests come through. If it matches those parameters, it'll intercept that request, responding with the mock. Or if it doesn't match those, it'll let it go through just as a typical AJAX request. So since our URL is json-1.php, and I threw a star character on the end, so anything that begins with that, I'm going to have a response time of 1.5 seconds. And the response text, I'm just going to provide an object literal. So I have JSON coming back here. I'm going to set the response text, which is the actual XML HTTP request object response that comes. It will then have a list of states, just Oregon, because that's the only state. So now that I've uncommented this, I haven't changed any of my production code. So up here at the top, my, whoops, somewhere around here, you'll notice that my json1.php, here it is, still exists. And if I go ahead and to my browser, I go ahead and refresh it. It doesn't work. This is not the night for demos. Response time, mockjax works. Okay, I'm going to cheat. There we go. Okay, I did double star. It was a wildcard. Every URL that came through, it was going to match. And you'll see down, oh, man. Okay. There. And you'll see down here at the bottom in Firebug, it says mock get. And that just means that the mockjax intercepted that request and then delivered back my payload. So I can see that there wasn't an actual AJAX request that went off. But this makes it really easy to develop your apps based against data services that don't exist, but in a production level way. So I think I'm really about out of time now. So, what?
Do you have an off by one error here?
Off by one? That was the wonderful browser autofilling that input value. Yes?
Do you have that MarkJax as a plugin?
Yes, it is a plugin. If you go to github.com/append2, actually go to Twitter. I tweeted it right before I came up here. So if you want to find me on Twitter, I am JD Sharp on Twitter. There you go. And my last tweet, hopefully, yep, here it is. There's my tweet, which takes you over to GitHub, which will give you the MockJax plugin. Additionally, there's a link. If you go to the wiki and you go to the blog post there, this goes in details the entire overview of the API and all the different flexibility that you can do with it. So, excellent. Do I have time for questions?
Yes.
Okay. We'll do some questions if there are some questions. And yes?
So if you go back to the code sample where you could have used a template plugin, but you didn't.
Okay. Where I would have used templating would have been right here, where I was constructing my HTML just using jQuery. Templating would provide a way to construct this in a single fragment, and instead of doing string concatenation, I could actually put in variables for it to replace, which is really beneficial if you have like a list of elements, which I do here, and you can construct your entire HTML string in Fragment and inject it instead of doing it row by row by row.
So what my actual question was, so there, that technically could be, unless I misunderstood it, that could be a security issue where you've written it, because there could be HTML in the variable that it's been.
Yes. Okay. So
How would you encourage doing sort of encoding HTML encoding there if you couldn't use a template plugin? I guess templating to do that.
Okay. So the question was, there could potentially be a security issue here because you could arbitrarily have HTML coming back that would get then injected and do something exciting like a cross-site script. There's a couple things that you could do. One is ideally the data coming back from the server is already sanitized. The other approach would be through regular expressions sanitization of these variables. So you could write a clean method, for example, that goes through and does the HTML escaping of the brackets to their HTML entities.
Like there's nothing built into jQuery.
I believe that jQuery.text does it.
jQuery.text does it?
Text.
Oh.
Oh, yeah.
But how could you pass a string into text? Well, oh, sorry. Yes. Okay, so you could do.
So .text, text string. Yes, exactly.
Like that. Okay. Yes, that's an excellent solution to that.
Or you could always like make a node, use that text, and then extract the text if you were not in a situation where this made sense.
Yes. Yeah. So you could, rather than.
Like that could be your clean function.
Yes. Rather than. Okay, I got to write it. There you go. jQuery is awesome. Okay.
How much code do you need to write to make the table become resizable columns?
Okay. The question was, how much code do you have to write to make a table have resizable columns? That in itself is not a trivial thing to do, but there are a number of jQuery plugins out there that already exist that give you that behavior. I don't know of one off the top of my head, but if you contact me, I'll track one down for you. So. Okay, now it's time for giveaways.